Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me this morning. Thank you for joining us so that we can have a chat about the research that I've done over the last period of time and published last month. A pretty extensive report looking into electricity pricing in the United Kingdom. I'm going to wait just a couple of minutes to let some more people sort of filter in. And once that's all happened, I'll kick off. So this presentation today will be recorded. So if there's any reason that you'd like to share it with other people, we'll have it up on YouTube afterwards and we'll send a link so that you can do so. We're also going to have space in the chat for questions. If there's time at the end of the presentation to address those questions, then I certainly will. Otherwise, I will just collect them at the conclusion of the presentation and I'll go through them individually and then I will respond to them in some public capacity so that all of those questions can be addressed that might have been stimulated through the presentation. So I think I will begin. So thanks very much for joining us this morning. My name is Nicholas Harrington. I'm a research associate with a body called CASH, which is the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, and that's housed with the University of Glasgow. My intention today is to present in hopefully a simple to understand and comprehensible way, the results of around 6 months of work into a particular project, which was to try to unravel, unpick and understand how electricity pricing is formed in the United Kingdom with the ultimate ambition of addressing it for a net zero contextualized purpose. So thank you very much again for joining us and we'll get started. So to situate the research, the first thing that I'd like to suggest is that the notion of decarbonisation really is an electrification strategy. So when we're talking about decarbonising transport, domestic setting, industry, in the main, we're talking about electrification. Of course, there are some caveats about that, carbon capture, hydrogen, and so on. But in the main, it's an electrification strategy, which really means then that net zero, in a sense, you could underwrite, say, is the electrification of society. And that's very important because at present, the high price of electricity frustrates the UK's decarbonisation efforts and net zero ambitions. So having a high electricity price, not just relatively, but also absolutely, has a number of knock-on effects. The knock-on effects would be, for example, the slow adoption of heat pumps. Most people are quite aware of the spark gap, electricity to gas price ratio. There's also performance biases against heat pumps because of their running costs. So a lot of what we see in the behavioural data about people not thinking heat pumps work well in most homes, which they do, is really related to material aspects. So, for example, inflated capital costs required to get the heat pumps to be at a reasonable running cost expectation. There's also an additional retrofit burden because the higher the price of electricity, the greater, the deeper the retrofit, more energy efficiency measures you need, more insulation and so on. And that then has a knock-on into skills gap. So then we need more contractors, more people to fulfill those roles. There's also a cost of living implication because around 75% of people are presently enjoying very cheap gas central heating. Shifting them onto a more expensive form of fuel would potentially be problematic. Now, not all the knock-on effects are negative. There are some positive effects as well. We've seen a lot of demand-side innovation and as a technology catalyst. So there's been, significant uptake in solar arrays, in a domestic individual setting and storage and battery for that. There's advanced metering, time of use tariffs. So on a sort of the commercial supply side, we've seen some nice innovations as a result of the high price of electricity. Now, setting the scene for the UK electricity system, a few really nice things about the electricity market. In the first instance, it's an open, competitive, investment-driven and deregulated market. So we've seen amazing increases in competition and market participants over the last sort of 10, 15 years, which is fantastic. And because of that openness of the system and the encouragement of investment, the UK has the fourth highest share of renewables in Europe in 2022. But it's not all great because alongside such a high level of renewables investment and share of renewables in the supply mix, we also have the most expensive household electricity in Europe. And the UK also has notoriously the largest spark gap in Europe. So the difference between the cost of 1 kilowatt hour of electricity versus the cost of 1 kilowatt hour of gas is extremely detrimental for our purposes here. Now, the preliminary questions or problems that stimulated the research is, for example, how is it possible or why is it that as we've had an increasing share of renewables generated electricity in the supply mix, The price of electricity has also increased steadily. This seems counterintuitive. You would imagine that the more low-cost generated electricity you get in the supply mix as a proportion of total consumption, that you would somehow get a diminution of pricing, and that hasn't happened. The other question then is, why does the price of electricity track so closely the price of gas? And we've seen that over the last 5 years, certainly, there's in about 98% of cases, the price of electricity is determined and set by the price of gas. Just to give to frame how distorting that impact is, in 2021, so prior to the gas crisis, or around that, to give a sort of a benchmark period, Russian gas accounted for a mere 4% of the UK's total energy supply. However, during the Ukraine war and the energy crisis that ensued, the disruption to those Russian gas supplies led to a 523% increase in the price of forward delivery contracts in the United Kingdom. So there's something structurally that needs to be examined here, how it can have such an overweighted, distorting influence. Now, this issue of higher pricing driven by wholesale prices, driven by energy costs, this is by no means new, and it's an ongoing issue. So it hasn't simply abated as the energy crisis in Ukraine has abated. So, for example, pre-energy crisis, the Ofgem price cap was around $11.50 for the year. Post-crisis, around $1,700 for the year, which means that energy remains 50% more expensive than it was pre-crisis. And according to Cornwall Insight, just going to duck out of the way, they're expecting a 3% forecast increase for Q1 2025. So this also isn't something that we can expect to be ameliorated simply by leaving the situation as is. So the research questions: what drives and influences the price of electricity in the UK? How can the price of electricity be brought down? So we want long-term structural solutions. And how can we uncouple the price of electricity from the price of gas? And in sum, how do we get all consumers to benefit from the low cost of renewables generated electricity, bearing in mind that this has everything to do with decarbonisation and net zero? The cheaper electricity is, the easier it is to facilitate a lot of our net zero ambitions. That's not to say that it's a silver bullet, won't fix everything, but certainly it's true that the high price of electricity just makes things harder. So the research methodology that was deployed in the research was systems thinking. Now, systems thinking is essentially a conceptual apparatus, a set of heuristics, a set of thinking tools that you can make use of. First and foremost, we consider electricity production and pricing as a whole system. So it's a holistic way of looking at the evidence and trying to interpret it. The other thing to say about the holistic conception is that the high price of electricity is an outcome, a product of the system as a whole. It is not a product simply of any one particular aspect. Therefore, what we're really trying to understand are the relationships between different elements in the system and how these elements interact, what impact they have on one another, the dynamic interplay between them, and so on and so forth. So we're not looking simply at one aspect in isolation. We're trying to see these interrelationships, interactions, knock-on effects, feedback loops, and so on. So this means then, in the end, that we're looking for interactions and dynamics between elements and between institutions or mechanisms or processes or infrastructure. And we're looking for feedback loops, both positive and negative. The other thing to say is that we're deeply interested in empirical results based on these interactions. So we're trying to move away from this is how something is supposed to work or this is how something ought to work, and really focusing more on the idea, well, this is what actually happens. Why does this actually happen? Why do these in practice real world outcomes, what are the interactions and influences and interactions that lead to those particular outcomes? And when you can understand the interactions and feedback loops, it then helps you identify certain leverage points, that is to say, parts of the system that seem to be incredibly impactful to generating these outcomes that we're interested in. And then those then can become sites for policy intervention or improvement or amelioration. So the scope of the research, I'm primarily interested in affordability. And the reason that I put that caveat is because there are certain things that the electricity market in the United Kingdom does extremely well. great at grid decarbonisation, great at renewables generation investment, and pretty good, if not very good, at security of supply. So this is not touching upon those issues. That is done very well, but we're talking about affordability. In particular, I'm looking at explanation of why do we see our system's particular outcomes. We want to look at root causes. And then the solutions are then determined by those root causes. So once we've addressed the why in this sort of causal chain, these feedback loops and so on, then that would then determine what you're going to look at. So in other words, it's a methodology where you don't pre-select the thing that you already assume is the problem. You look at the system, understand its dynamics, and based on that examination, you can then identify, okay, well, then this then logically would be what needs to be dealt with. And ultimately, we're seeking long-term and structural solutions. The focus, based on the survey, we built system maps of the electricity market, which are in the report. You can have a look at them. They show the different elements, how those interactions work. Ultimately, we led to the decision to focus on the wholesale electricity price formation. Now, why did we do that? What is the rationale for that? Well, the rationale, first and foremost, is that it is the largest component of what a consumer will pay for their electricity bill in the United Kingdom. You can see that the wholesale cost is 35% of the price. Now, that's not to say that the other portions are inconsiderable. It is to say, however, that we're looking for something which can be a long-term solution rather than a short-term solution, and an absolute rather than a relative solution. And in a sense, this is a way of making some commentary on a very, very popular and worthy and laudable suggestion, which is to address the environmental social policy costs, which are unfairly tacked onto electricity relative to gas. But the issue is that may not be a long-term solution. If, as I am suggesting, net zero is the electrification of society, and ultimately everyone is going to be using electricity through clean heat solutions and so on to heat their homes, for example, then shifting them onto gas is a temporary measure to facilitate people to move onto electricity, but ultimately those costs will still have to be borne. So either they're going to go back onto electricity or they'll be on general taxation. So that's one reason that wasn't the primary emphasis of the research. I really want to look, that's not to say we shouldn't do it. Perhaps that is a measure in some capacity that can be done, but really the focus here is the wholesale price, because if you can address the wholesale price, you can bring the price of electricity down absolutely, rather than simply relatively, that is to say, relative to the price of gas. I'll also just point out this data, this graph that I've produced here, it's really difficult to find what the Ofgem breakdown is for this particular year. Most studies seem to rely on, if you go to the Ofgem website, they'll give you, I think it's a graph from 2020. So it's quite old and doesn't reflect the post-energy crisis dynamics. So I'm talking about the distribution between wholesale costs, environmental policy costs, network costs. So this took a bit of searching to find these data and going through a lot of tables. So it's not that easy, but it's interesting if you look at other studies that show the breakdown of the electricity bill cost. They're usually relying on 2020 data, which is just an interesting point there. So wholesale price. How is wholesale price formed? Well, the first thing to say is that most of the electricity that is traded in the wholesale market is traded in the forward market. So that's 70 to 80%. And these are over-the-counter bilateral agreements between generators and suppliers. That includes things like purchase power agreements and just, the long-term contracts, which usually the period is like 1 month to 3 years. And how they determine the prices for the forward market contracts that are being signed bilaterally between the generators and suppliers is by trying to hedge against volatility. So trying to hedge against expectations about forward movements or future movements, price movements with respect to electricity pricing. And how do they make those determinations? They look at the spot market, which happens much, much more frequently. So the forward market, where the bulk of the electricity is traded, is highly influenced and driven by what happens in the spot market. So we need to have a look at the spot market. By the way, you can see there on the graph, the forward market trended as you would expect based on the energy crisis over that period. So the spot market, 20 to 30% of electricity is traded here. It happens either day ahead, so between days, or during the day on a 24-hour period. Every half hour electricity is traded. And so this is the balance of what's required to balance total demand with supply. at any given time. Now, the spot market, although it's a smaller proportion of all traded electricity, has an outsized influence because this is where we have a mechanism where auctions, it's traded under auction conditions, excuse me, and those auction conditions apply a pricing rule known as pay as clear or system marginal pricing. So you can see here that in the spot market, obviously we had the same volatility as we had in the forward market, tracking again the energy crisis. You can also see that where the spot market prices are today is much higher than they were prior to the energy crisis. So this is an ongoing issue despite the crisis, quote unquote, having abated. So what is system marginal pricing? What is pay as clear auction rules? Why do these impact the spot market? What influence do they have? What impact does system marginal pricing or pay as clear auction rules have? So system marginal pricing is essentially the notion that in any given auction, whatever the price is of the last unit required to fulfill all the demand that's needed within that auction sets the price for everything that is then traded during that period, during that auction. So that means that, for example, if 99% of the electricity traded during an auction is dispatched from renewables generators, but the final 1% in that auction comes from a gas power plant, then 100% of the electricity traded during that auction is priced at the bid of the gas-fired powered plant. So it's totally not proportional to what is actually being dispatched at that time. It is entirely dependent on the final unit. System marginal pricing, final unit, marginal, last unit. Okay. So the effect is then that consumers can only benefit from lower generation costs of renewables when renewables represent 100% of the electricity traded in a given period. And this is a situation that is exceedingly rare. And I'll explain why that is exceedingly rare. Now, the system marginal pricing also is highly related to what is known as the merit order and the merit order effect. And so this we can see on this little schematic here exactly what I was saying. So you can see that the first, few rounds of electricity that was sort of bid into the spot market and agreed to came from renewables, but then there wasn't any more renewables. So then they had to rely on some nuclear. So the price was a little higher. Then there wasn't any more renewables. So we relied on some gas. And finally, then that gas price of that last unit of gas price then set the price for all that was traded in that period. Now, the idea then is the more renewables you get, you would then push the other generators out of the market, out of the merit order. So the more renewables in the mix, then you can squeeze out the less competitive and less economically rational to consume units. This is the theory, but this doesn't happen in practice to an extent where we are now seeing renewables set the price of electricity. So that again begs the question, why is that? And I'll go on and explain why that is. So the implications of system marginal pricing of spot markets that are set under auction rules of pay as clear is that so long as gas generated electricity remains the marginal unit required to fulfill total demand, increasing the proportion of renewables generated electricity will have no appreciable effect in lowering consumer prices for the foreseeable future. Again, the interest of this research is to address affordability. So that's why this then is obviously of concern. It doesn't mean that you're not getting to a situation where you're almost totally decarbonizing the grid. You can totally decarbonize the grid, but electricity is still exceedingly expensive. And that's I think the dilemma which I'm certainly presenting and discussing in this presentation. So, for example, the wholesale price of electricity can remain the same under conditions where renewables represent 42%, like we had in 2022, 51.6%, as we had in Q2 of this year, or even 98% of the total supply mix in a given auction if the final proportion of demand is fulfilled by gas-fired power plants. So in other words, simply increasing the proportion of renewables into the supply mix is not an immediate solution to lowering electricity prices. Now, some people might say, but wait a second, what about contracts for difference? What about the paybacks? When there's a strike price agreed under the contract for difference and the wholesale price exceeds that, the generator has to pay that excess money back to the low carbon contracts company, and then that money will flow back to consumers. So there is a reduction in pricing. In theory, that is certainly how it should work. In practice, the evidence for this effect is very hard to observe. So the LCCC, the Low Carbon Contracts Company, levies the suppliers for the contracts for difference scheme, the suppliers charge the customers. So that part is clear to see. The customers pay for the CFD scheme. Generators who make excess payments make those excess payments. Sorry, and just to clarify, so in case there's any confusion, so CFD, it's like a 15-year contract between the government and a renewables generator at an agreed fixed price. No matter what happens to the price of electricity, you're going to get this strike price. If it's below the strike price, we'll pay you the top up. If it's above the strike price, you will remunerate the LCCC for that excess. And then the idea being that that excess is the payback that you would hope, or that in theory, customers benefit from. So the generators make the excess payments to LCCC. The LCCC remits it back to suppliers, but the suppliers are under no legal obligation to pass the savings on to consumers. And it's not clear that that's happened. The other thing to mention is that we have a relatively sort of solid level of vertical integration in the UK market. So 42% of all of the supply is undertaken by generators that are also suppliers. So in other words, in 42% of the cases, the excess payments would go to the LCCC and then back to the same company. The other thing to note is that in a lot of cases, the supply side of the business is the loss-making portion of the business. Anyway, that's certainly the case for SSE and Centrica. On their balance sheets, the supply side is not a profitable part of the business. The earnings are generated in the generation side, but I'll come upon that a little bit later. The other thing to say is that renewables generators that are not on the CFD scheme, well, of course, they don't make any excess payments to the LCCC. And as it is presently, 84% of renewables generators are not on the CFD scheme as of 2023. I mean, obviously, the more auctions that come, the greater that number will increase. But right now, that's the case. So in other words, 92% of total UK generation is not part of the CFD scheme. So even if there was a really strong linear direct link between the contract for difference paybacks and the consumers, in 92% of the case, that doesn't really apply anyway. So just to finish up, some more implications of system marginal pricing. There are systemic disincentives for certain investments, certain kinds of investments from market incumbents. So, for example, anything that might displace gas as the marginal generator, there is a rational commercial disincentive to invest in those kinds of things or to advocate for those kinds of things. And so the obvious ones would be there's a clear market incumbent disincentive to replace system marginal pricing because the incumbents greatly benefit from system marginal pricing. The other thing to say is that there's also a material systemic disincentive to invest in adequate system flexibility by these market incumbents that are benefiting from the current market arrangement. And I will explain that in further detail and what is meant by adequate system flexibility later in the presentation. So you might say, oh, okay, well, that's a bit of a heavy claim to say that people benefit. Well, what do we mean? What do you mean they benefit? What sort of disincentive are we talking about? Well, here are three of the larger generators, and all this data is just from the disclosures, the annual balance sheet disclosure statements that they are required to make to Ofgem. So prior to the crisis, SSE had EBITDA, so like their earnings, was around 844 million. After the crisis, at the end year of the crisis ensuing, when we had this situation with the price of gas, their earnings, not revenue, their earnings, so their EBITDA was 1.8 billion. So they made about an extra $1 billion. For EDF, they had 316 prior, and then they had 1.5 billion, as a result of the high gas prices. So their earnings increased by over $1 billion. And for Centrica, they didn't make quite $1 billion, but pretty close. So it was like 850 extra million because of what happened to the gas price. So you can see there is a pretty strong material disincentive to do away with system marginal pricing from those market incumbents. So let's now talk a little bit about renewables generated electricity and system flexibility infrastructure. So the issue, of course, with renewables, as can be seen here with the graph, is that the wind doesn't blow all the time, and the solar isn't generating during the night. So you can see that there is a great degree of generation volatility through renewables. And this then, of course, means that you can't have the supply exactly when you want it. The other problem, of course, is that you don't have the supply exactly where you want it. Because you can see here on this little graph, we have a distribution of wind farms in the United Kingdom, and they're clearly unevenly geographically distributed. So this, I guess, is the fundamental and profound issue and constraint of renewables, is that it is both intermittent and constrained. So it is a time-based intermittency, so you have generation volatility, and it's spatially constrained. So there's a locational mismatch. And that then is, in a sense, why we then have what we see in the spot market, because you forever needing, not forever, but in most cases, you need a top up, and the top up is for these on-demand generators such as gas. To sort of show again and perhaps talk a little bit further about the relationship between increasing investment in new renewables and price, and how that may not have an appreciable effect. At present, the installed capacity of all renewables generators in 2022 was already 87.5% of peak demand. So theoretically, if all of those renewables generators were operating at capacity and supplying all simultaneously, then you would see that from what we already have, there is 87.5% of peak demand can be met by the theoretic potential install capacity of our renewables. However, renewables in that year only supplied, or their proportion of supply was 42% of the total dispatched electricity in that year. So that means that theoretically, there's already in the system a 45.5% shortfall in system efficiency. And what I mean by system efficiency is, like, you've got the theoretical total generation capacity of renewables, and then what do we actually get out of them? Well, then there's some loss there, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. And so it also shows that there is a non-linear relationship between installed capacity and supply share. So in other words, more solar panels doesn't necessarily mean you get more into the supply mix, more wind farms, depending on where they are, and so on and so forth. And you can understand, because all solar panels generate electricity. I mean, obviously there's exceptions, of course, to this, but by and large, they're generating electricity at the same time. And the grid, that means that at certain times it's too much, and they have to be constrained, or at other times it's insufficient and there needs to be supplemented. So just more doesn't necessarily mean there's a linear relationship to increases in generation in the supply mix. Now, talking about system flexibility infrastructure, what is meant by that? Now, this is a big part of, as was mentioned before, and this is essentially system flexibility infrastructure is highly related to the intermittency and constrained nature of renewables. So system flexibility, as I'm presenting in the research, it deals fundamentally with the physical infrastructure. So we're talking about the transmission lines and cables, storage facilities, so pumped hydro, batteries, thermal batteries, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's demand side responses, time of use tariffs, and smart appliances. But I'm particularly interested in the physical infrastructure, because it is the physical infrastructure that allows you to overcome these natural sort of limitations of renewables generated electricity. So definition: the physical infrastructure, technology, and demand side response that ensures renewables generated electricity is available where and when it is demanded across the UK. So that's how I'm defining in the report system flexibility infrastructure. An example is adequate flexibility infrastructure would mean electricity generated by Scottish wind farms could reach the south of England while solar energy becomes available in the evenings UK-wide. So no longer is, so with adequate system flexibility and with adequate flexibility infrastructure, you can overcome this limitation of nature, of geography and weather that is fundamental to renewables generation. So adequate flexibility infrastructure would ensure that electricity generated from renewable sources, which are typically low cost, has a greater influence on the wholesale electricity price rather than gas-powered generation, which is directly tied to the gas price. Implications of adequate system flexibility: with adequate system flexibility infrastructure, electricity generated from renewable sources can be transformed, sort of conceptually transformed in terms of its utility, from an intermittent and constrained source of electricity supply into an on-demand source of electricity supply. So if it can be sent where it needs to go and it can be stored for when it's needed, then it can now be on demand, and it's no longer something which is kind of a bit lumpy, lots of volatility, which we need something else to fill in the gaps. Adequate flexibility infrastructure permits renewables generate electricity to more reliably and consistently be called upon as the marginal unit required to fulfill total demand at any given time. And then you can see the relationship now starting to emerge between system flexibility and what's happening in the spot market, system flexibility and system marginal pricing. With adequate system flexibility, then maybe the final unit is now renewables. In other words, renewables sets the price for the whole auction there. Adequate flexibility infrastructure would structurally lower the wholesale price of electricity based on the merit order effect. As we said, if renewables now can be called upon, or renewables generate electricity can be called upon, we don't need to call upon the more expensive sources. So then they fall out the merit order and they're no longer then setting the price for that whole auction under system marginal pricing. Now, the UK, as I've sort of started to intimate, is in somewhat of a double bind. And I'm sure that anyone listening now is quite clear what the double bind is. The double bind is that we have system marginal pricing and system marginal pricing in conjunction with inadequate flexibility infrastructure. So what if we had system marginal pricing but adequate system flexibility? Well, that would mean that renewables generate electricity would be the marginal price, marginal unit, more frequently, and that would lower wholesale prices. So in other words, if you kept pay as clear or kept system marginal pricing and but had adequate system flexibility, then you can have renewables generate electricity setting the wholesale price more often. What if you had inadequate system flexibility but no system marginal pricing? Well, in that case, then the wholesale price is permitted to reflect potentially the proportion of renewables generated electricity in the supply mix. So like we had now, or for 2022, excuse me, 42% of the electricity was from renewables generated. That means that 42% of what constituted the wholesale price could have come from that renewables or be set by that renewables price, and the balance would have been whatever the balance of those generators were. So a healthy electricity system can tolerate one or other of these dysfunctions. So you can have system marginal pricing inadequate, or you can have inadequate system flexibility, but no system marginal pricing. The issue, and when I say healthy, again, we're talking about affordability. This is the primary sort of direction and theme of this, related to then how the electricity price makes net zero more challenging and frustrates it and slow and so on. So a healthy electricity system can tolerate one or other, but having both, that really is the chronic issue. So what are the impacts of the double bind? So what do we actually find because we have both system marginal pricing and inadequate flexibility? Well, I don't think any of this is now, all of this will seem very, very straightforward. The marginal unit sets a wholesale price, SMP effect. The marginal unit is rarely renewables generate electricity because of inadequate flexibility effect. The marginal unit is most often gas, inadequate flexibility effect, and gas sets the price, and that's the SMP effect. So you can see now, this is very much from a systems point of view, there is a profound dynamic interaction between these two elements, and these then cause considerable effects and have a profound impact on the wholesale price. So inadequate flexibility infrastructure promotes the adverse pricing effects of a market environment structured by system marginal pricing. And system marginal pricing auction rules extend the adverse pricing impact of inadequate system flexibility across the entire electricity market system. Now, as will come later in the talk, when we talk about something like zonal pricing, that would then deal to a certain extent with this second point, because it's no longer spread across the entire market. It becomes somewhat localized. But it's important to understand that with having both of these, both system marginal pricing and inadequate flexibility, the inadequate flexibility essentially means that what's happening in the spot market is extremely distorted relative to what's going on in the generation pool. And if you have a system marginal pricing, then whatever the problems you have in really kind of anywhere within the system in terms of flexibility, well, that's felt system-wide. So what are the solutions and what are the recommendations that were determined from the research? So first of all, again, you can see the sort of the logical, the transitive order here of logic. So the research has identified system flexibility as the problem. or inadequate system flexibility is one of the elements that in a dynamic fashion relates to something else. So therefore, we're looking at addressing that. So what we require in the United Kingdom is to overcome this situation and get affordable electricity. We must have adequate flexibility infrastructure. And it sort of means adequate flexibility infrastructure everywhere, because if we don't have adequate flexibility infrastructure in certain places, then, and we have the system marginal pricing, then we're still in kind of the same situation. So you do need to have adequate flexibility as a systemic reality, would overcome the distorting pricing effects of a market environment structured by system marginal pricing. The second recommendation, should come as no surprise given what's come in this presentation, is to move away from system marginal pricing or pay-as-clear auction rules. If we moved away from system marginal pricing and pay-as-clear, we would ameliorate the distorting price impact of inadequate system flexibility. That said, that would be in certain areas more than others. So in a sense, there would be a bit of an uneven patterning, because certain areas, because they're not, immediately close to generation facilities of renewables, and because of the inadequate flexibility infrastructure, they're still going to be more expensive than others. But at a very least, moving away from SMP, what the price that's paid, the wholesale price, reflects the proportion of renewables generation in the mix. So in terms of adequate flexibility infrastructure, I think it is worthwhile seeing this flexibility infrastructure as a public good. So electricity under net zero, it conforms to two of the conditions that are required for things to be considered public goods. It's non-excludable. We cannot, in a net zero future where we have an electrification of society, exclude people from the use of electricity. It also has non-rivalrous consumption in the sense that, provided we have appropriate security of supply, someone's use doesn't take away from somebody else's use. Of course, in times of uncertain security, you can have a situation where certain areas may not be able to access electricity. But in general, someone's use of electricity in one house has no real appreciable effect of someone else's use in the next house across. So it's non-excludable and it's non-rivalrous consumption. And essentially, there's no choice. Everyone's going to have to use electricity. So it's essentially, we're talking about something which is a provision of a public good. And I would like to think about system flexibility in the same way that highways are thought of under the Department of Transport. We are essentially building the highways and the transmission facility to get everybody the electricity that they need so that they can, inhabit this net zero future where we're all enjoying carbon-free electricity. It's also possible, the way that I'm conceiving it of as a public good, is that you can actually have a situation where the public is receiving revenue, or the government is a revenue model there, where people are paying the government rather than private institutions for the provision of the flexibility infrastructure. I've already said that there's a profound disincentive for just to rely on market-based solutions. And I think that's worth just reiterating that the market-based incentives for flexibility are very different than those required to achieve the adequacy that we're talking about to get to a place where electricity is affordable. So in terms of a market-based or commercial orientation, it's quite logical. Profitability will direct the investment rather than need. So in other words, these projects that we're talking about are extremely expensive. So building, undersea cables and transmission infrastructure is a huge capital cost. So the interests in where and which of those projects would be undertaken by private enterprise are going to be the ones that they conceive to be profitable. And this will mean that they expect to be able to make money on those, certainly not just money, but profit on those in excess of their, long-term planning on these capital investments, which would mean you would necessitate network charges and there'd be increased generator and supply cost. So if these things are left to market-based incentives, certainly in the short term, electricity becomes more expensive again. Rather than less expensive, it becomes more expensive because you have additional costs put on top. And until you reach adequacy, that was going to be always the case. But I think more important than that is that there will forever be gaps in the system, because there are going to be lots of things and places that are not profitable. And one thing that we encounter, one thing that we encounter there is the return on investment paradox, which you can imagine that it gets to a point where the investment in, say, storage, battery storage, or infrastructure, if it works as it's meant to do, it will lower the wholesale price. So therefore, it lowers the price at which this scheme itself may have been based. So either you accept that there's this paradox or you lock in extra cost to cover that. And so there's additional cost built in through having a private mechanism for doing this rather than my recommendation, which is a government orientated process. So I'm looking for government responsibility and priority around adequate system infrastructure. Absolutely the strategic policy. It should be government deciding what is being built, where, how, and when, based on understanding and conceiving where the gaps are and understanding how we achieve adequacy. And then there should be funding control. So it might be direct funding, might be public-private partnerships, could be conditional private investment, but there should be funding control, and fundamentally the government should be able to say, here is where we need to have system infrastructure so that we can reach adequacy, and these are the projects that are going to be instituted. Alternatives to system marginal pricing or pay as clear. There are obviously, well, there's two that I've listed here. The first is zonal pricing, and the second is pay at bid auction rules. So zonal pricing is an alternative to system marginal pricing because essentially you're breaking up or dividing the United Kingdom into different zones, and each of them would be a self-contained market, and each of them would then trade their own electricity and potentially, if they needed, import electricity from other zones to fulfill total demand in that zone at any given time. Now, all the evidence suggests that zonal pricing would lower the wholesale cost of electricity somewhat from where we are now. So it does that, but it also patterns great price variation. So you can imagine that under zonal pricing, electricity will be a lot cheaper in certain parts of the countries than in other. So, for example, in Scotland, where there's a lot of generation of wind sources, there will be times when electricity should be under zonal pricing very affordable. But in the southeast of England, this may not be the case, and a variety of other locations where you'd see this discrepancy. So zonal pricing is an alternative, for sure, to system marginal pricing, but essentially it's really zonal marginal pricing as well, which is another thing to consider. So zonal pricing, as it's presently conceived, doesn't do away with pay as clear as the auction clearing mechanism within the zones. So that means, again, any zone that doesn't have adequate system flexibility is going to have the same problems with wholesale price that we see system-wide now. So again, this is the reason for the great variation in price that you see in the zonal pricing models, is because some zones will have either enough generation of different sources of renewables to bring them to a place where it's cheaper a lot more often, and other places don't have the generation, nor do they have the system flexibility infrastructure. So that's something certainly to be aware of, that the zonal pricing doesn't do away with pay as clear, doesn't really do away with this SMP effects, it just localizes them, and it certainly doesn't address the adequate system flexibility, except insofar as, and this is certainly true of zonal pricing, it could send very strong signals that, oh my gosh, here's an area where electricity is just outrageously expensive. We should go and, there's a really strong economic rationale to do some investment in some system flexibility. But the issue is then you still encounter the return on investment paradox, in the sense that by addressing that problem, then that scheme becomes less profitable unless they lock in costs to cover the development. So it's not the most efficient way, certainly, to bring prices down in that way. But it is true that if you're going to pattern the United Kingdom through a zonal map and have certain areas where electricity is a lot more expensive than others, then that will send signals. Well, if you're going to put system flexibility anywhere, well, this is where you should be putting it because this is where it is needed, or this is where more renewables investment is needed. So from the point of view, the argument that it makes granular investment decisions or permits investment decisions to be made on a granular basis, and that could potentially be more strategic in how things are deployed, that is 100% true. It still remains an outstanding question on the basis of the research I've done, whether it really addresses the wholesale price issue in any zone that still doesn't have adequate system flexibility. So in any zone that doesn't have adequate system flexibility, well, we're kind of in the same problem, because you have a pay-as-clear system marginal pricing scenario within the localized zone setting the wholesale price. So my recommendation, what I view as being more reliably likely to bring about the effects we'd like to see, is pay-as-bid auction rules for the spot market, which in essence is the notion that you send the electricity that is bid in. So the wholesale price reflects the proportion of renewables in the supply mix. So if we look at that merit order that we had before, so whatever the renewables that are bid in, they're bid into the market at that price. That's what the supplier will pay for those for that electricity, and then the merit order goes up. So in other words, you're just going to get paid, or you're going to pay out according to the bids that are made from the generators based on their own cost basis. So logically, the renewables generators are going to bid their electricity into the market cheaper than the nuclear, than the gas, and so on. And so at least you're going to get a wholesale price that is reflective of the proportion. Now, that the benefits of this is that the affordability is extended UK wide, because that proportion then under a single market is experienced consistently. The other thing I would say is that I'm not persuaded by the predominant argument against pay as bid auction rules, and this is the tactical bidding argument. And some of you may have heard this before, some of you may be unfamiliar, but essentially the argument against pay as bid, because okay, let's just say this. So you might say, well, I mean, that's obviously logical. Yes, you just pay as bid. You just get people to pay. Like, why wouldn't we do this? Why are we not doing this now? And that's certainly a comment that I've had from a lot of people who are non-experts in the energy markets who have asked me those questions. I said, well, why wouldn't you just, do that? And then I've said, well, the reason is that there is a very common argument against pay as bid, which is known as tactical bidding. The tactical bidding argument goes like this. If you don't have payers clear, then the lower cost generators are simply going to up the price to which they bid their electricity to the market in anticipation of the marginal unit price. So in other words, they say, oh, well, we all know that, that gas is going to set the price anyway, so we'll just bid it at the gas price regardless. So this is the sort of the claim that is made. So in other words, there's no point doing pay as bid, because you're just going to get the same result as you get with pay as clear, because the generators are just going to bid their price up in anticipation of what the marginal unit is going to be. Now, I am not persuaded by that argument really at all, mainly because the UK market it doesn't really afford generators that opportunity. It is highly competitive. Individual generators lack the market power to be able to do that. And we also have the ameliorating effects of the contracts for difference scheme. So I'll talk about the contract for difference scheme in a moment, but just to look at what the market looks like. So there are 55 separate companies that generate and provide electricity supply to the United Kingdom. And that's across over 1,300 different power stations. Now, you can say there, oh, okay, but, a lot of them are quite small and relatively, non-influential in terms of their generation. So, okay, so we go to the top 17, and you can see that of the top 17 companies, this is very competitive. 17 different companies in that space in the top 17 is a lot. And 6 of them are 100% renewable generated electricity. So in other words, you have a situation where they want to dispatch their electricity. So their motivation is to get their electricity sold and dispatched. And if they set the price higher in a competitive marketplace like this, then they may not sell their electricity at all, or they're worried about the competition from people who will undercut them. So actually, this effect is not as likely to occur, or it is quite unlikely to occur in this kind of highly competitive market with so many market participants. And then the last thing that I'll talk about, just going back to that question of CFDs, is that as we are having more and more generators who are on the CFD scheme, they're on contracted strike prices. So they have zero motivation to bid to the marginal unit, supposedly. Why would they do that? Because whatever they bid in excess, they just have to pay back to the LCCC anyway. So in a sense, at the very least, under pay-as-bid auction rules, you'll have the strike price being a baseline of what the price, the renewables generator will be. But as I said, as there's an increasing volume of these schemes and an increasing volume of auctions successfully for new contract for difference schemes, you now have a whole lot of market participants and an increasingly number that have absolutely no rationale to bid towards and employ this tactical bidding argument, because they're on CFD strike prices anyway. So I have come to the end of the presentation. If anyone would like to send me an email so that I can send them the report, or if they have any questions, or if they have any feedback based on the report or the presentation here, then please do send it. I see that we do have a couple of questions, I believe, in the chat. So I will see if I can access those. Is that correct? Yes, we do. All right, just give me 1 second. Okay, so here are the questions. The advantage of system marginal pricing is that generators are incentivized to be honest about their marginal cost. Have you considered the risk of market manipulation from a pay-as-bid approach? And then you said, okay, you address this. So yeah, I mean, it's just, look, honestly though, the question is, it's really important to put that question out there, because it shows how common the argument against pay-as-bid on the basis of tactical bidding is. And the other thing I would just point out is that, as we sort of said from the previous slides, market incumbents benefit greatly from the current market arrangement. So there is a huge incentive for those, so either those associated with or lobbying on behalf of or involved with those beneficiaries, the market incumbents, to suggest that system marginal pricing is the only thing we could do, it's the only thing that would ever work. Anything else would be a complete disaster. And, you know, having read the first and second consultation reports from DESNZ about the REMA consultation, it's quite clear that the primary way to counter or to dissuade policymakers from engaging with pay-as-bid is to say it's all be tactical bidding. And then the next thing they'll do is they'll say, well, because it will be tactical bidding without evidence, we're going to need price controls. And you don't want price controls, do you? Because that goes to the antithesis of what we're talking about with a free, open, competitive market. So you can kind of see the logic of the argument against pay-as-bid is, pay-as-bid will lead to tactical bidding, and tactical bidding necessitates price controls, and nobody wants that. So I guess pay-as-bidding is just out the door. The issue, though, is that the case against pay-as-bid hasn't actually been made on the merits and hasn't been made empirically. It's just made theoretically. So it's made from an orthodox economics point of view. It's made from a very conventional economic theoretical conceptual framework, which in an ideal situation is correct. There are plenty of situations where the claim of tactical bidding is probably true. If you had, say, 2 or 3 market participants only, and they had a third. So say if you had oligopoly, okay, so we've got an oligopolist market and they have huge market control, then yeah, probably you're going to do that. It's the same thing, like, for example, there are many marketplaces with, say, supermarkets where you see that, where there's all sorts of price manipulation because there's only 2 big players. I mean, you can tell from my accent, I'm Australian. That happens in Australia, happens in New Zealand. Big problem. But we do not have that type of market in electricity in the United Kingdom. As I showed you, there are 55 different companies that are competing against one another to dispatch electricity to the grid. And a lot of the companies are told to produce less electricity because there's too much at certain times. So the idea that people have this sort of flexibility to manipulate and pit up prices doesn't make sense. It looks like we got one more question, so thank you. So it says, Nicholas, an interesting presentation. Thank you. System marginal pricing made sense in the 1990s when the alternatives were gas or coal. Any number of analysts have suggested alternatives, but governments have never had the backbone to tackle this distortion in a market with a substantial renewables component, not helped by several years of conservative governments who believe the market is the answer to everything. Not sure I would lump grid capacity and energy storage into a single term infrastructure flexibility. The practicability of any form of energy storage to cope with variability of wind, even if the country could afford it, is very doubtful. Yeah, I mean, I think these are, that's a fair point. I mean, it's not to say, again, my research isn't saying that how you would implement these. It was really to look, okay, we've got this system. What are the elements interacting together that have produced this outcome? And then we can say, okay, well, there's these 2 big problems here. We've got system marginal pricing, and we also have inadequate system flexibility. So we've got this double bind. How you actually go about fixing it? Yes, these are, and in the end of my report, I suggested a whole bunch of research questions to tackle this very question. How do we actually then, in practice, get to my solutions or the recommendations or beyond that? I think, one thing in terms of the energy storage with the variability of wind, one thing that I'm really impressed by is hydro pump storage. you can do that on a huge scale. I mean, you're talking about the scale of, dams, and that then potentially can store an enormous amount of wind energy. So I think that there's going to be, with the right thinking around this, there are technological solutions to very particular types of, problems. So maybe the wind one is resolved with hydro pumped, and maybe, and I see here we've got another comment here come through. A great deal of energy storage can be done through heat via heat networks. That's true. Also thermal. So you could have, for example, the storage done through different types of thermal materials, through sand retains heat quite well, et cetera, et cetera. So there's different ways of storing that aren't just batteries, because that's right. Like huge batteries is probably not the solution everywhere, but you have different types of storage mechanisms or different types. So here's the last one. I think we can go. Hi, Nick. I wonder what role, if any, you see for more public ownership and system planning in addressing these issues you described, particularly on flexibility. So, okay. So that wasn't a huge component of my research. So now I'm giving you an answer that's my personal preference. I'm a big proponent of public ownership. So what was initially in the Labor manifesto, I think their sort of, GB energy market scheme, this idea. I mean, if I think about like in an ideal situation, the public owns the generation of the energy. We pay essentially ourselves to circulate some revenue back. We have control. We get affordable energy. The money we pay for it circulates back in. That is an ideal situation for me. And that's why I've suggested that it be treated like, or that those flexibility aspects are treated like highways, and through the transport department, or like the underground in London, TfL. Like that is something that I'm personally in favor on. Now, I can't say that I have engaged with any research to say what are the empirical merits of doing that, what are the risks associated. Especially, this is the thing, we're not dealing with a tabula rasa. This is not, and whatever you do is going to come into existence with the existing system. So one thing that I'd want to obviously look at is, how does the journey of public ownership and public investment of this infrastructure look like side by side with private enterprises fulfilling a similar function? But in principle, yeah, I'd be super in favor of that. I mean, the thing is that we have examples across Europe of public ownership of these energy production and facilities, and they see differences in prices. So I think that's the last question. I very much appreciate everybody who's been on the webinar today. I will obviously post the recording. And if anyone, oh yeah, that's the other thing I was going to say. If anyone wants the slides, because obviously there's quite a lot of stuff of data and so on that I have references for, so you can go and fact check all of that. So you can email me for the slides or the report and so on. So I thank everybody for attending, and I wish everybody a wonderful rest of the week. So take care. Thank you very much.